Okay, still a fair number of people who are joining us now, but I feel like it's a good opportunity to get started in earnest. Once again, hi everyone. My name is Ben Silverman. I'm the Climate and Buildings Program Manager of the City of Boston, where I primarily work on the BERDO program, and I've also been a part of the team working on the development of this carbon emission performance standard over the last few months. Today, this is an informational webinar focused on just those BERDO covered buildings primarily, both the owners, managers, consultants, and people working in this space to help you all get situated and bring you up to speed on the work that the city has been engaged in over the last few months and will be continuing to work on in the future. So again, today we're talking about this work. The webinar will primarily focus on giving you all an overview of the work going on, what this means for you, and sort of part of the city's thinking on this work, as well as how to get involved. There'll be some very limited amount of time at the end for you to ask questions and provide feedback, but we are aiming to establish a number of more sector-specific focus groups for more in-depth discussion coming in the following weeks. So at the end of this webinar, there will be information of how to sign up if you're interested in participating in those, but as well. No, I do encourage folks that if you have specific comments and questions to type them into the chat, and we will come to them at the end of the presentation. Just to talk through, we will start by giving an overview of the work so far, with a focus on some of the big questions that we are wrestling with, and ask for your input and insights for discussion. We will then end with ways in which you can stay involved and through the planned focus groups in the future. So starting with a overview, the starting point for this work has, of course, is the city's goals that the mayor has committed Boston to be carbon neutral by 2050. That is greenhouse gas emissions neutral by then. We have already made significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions over the last 15 years, as seen in the slightly jagged blue line, and we're well on the way for meeting our 2020 emissions reduction goals. This achievement, should be emphasized, includes a lot of the work that folks on this call have been engaged with. So thank you for all your hard diligence. But as you can also see, that we still have a long way to go to any sort of 2050 carbon neutrality goals. We know that most of the greenhouse gas emissions in Boston come from buildings, and especially those largest buildings covered by the BERDO Ordinance, the Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance. To get to a carbon neutral city, we know we need to be pursuing three simultaneous strategies across all sectors: lowering energy demand, electrifying fossil fuel consumption wherever possible, and then getting our electricity from renewable sources. In terms of the existing building stock, as many of you know, we have a somewhat older building stock in Boston. Part of the goal is to make sure that every new building in Boston will be net zero ready moving forward. But the bigger task is going to ensuring that we are working to retrofit our existing buildings. In 2019, the city engaged in a very extensive climate action plan update process, building on top of the carbon-free Boston analysis. We convened a community working group that represented neighborhoods, organizations, and partners across the city, and helped to identify and shape the highest priority strategies to accelerate carbon reductions over the next few years. A number of the folks on this call, a number of the folks covered by BERDO were also part of that process. So thank you all for your work in this. From the climate action plan, the number of strategies for the building sector were proposed, and today we're just going to be focusing on strategy number 5, arguably one of our most ambitious. That is to develop a carbon emissions performance standard to decarbonize existing large buildings. The strategy would involve setting specific emissions targets for Boston's largest buildings that will presumably ratchet down over the years towards our 2050 carbon neutrality goal. Presently, as many of you know, we have the Building Energy Reporting Disclosure Ordinance, which has two main components. One is an annual reporting piece, and thank you everyone who has submitted their annual energy data to us over the last few weeks and months. And then there's the energy action assessment requirement, a requirement that every 5 years, buildings covered by it have to show that they've either lowered their emissions or otherwise have are pursuing energy assessments and actions that will help them to do so. The current thinking is that this new performance standard will come to be an update to BERDO in replacing the existing energy action assessment requirement with this performance standard, while the annual energy data reporting piece will continue. The core idea here is that a carbon emission performance standard is meant to help the city lower its emissions, but it's also important that it will help to drastically lower energy costs while improving the indoor and outdoor air quality and comfort for tenants and occupants across the city. That's the focus and goal of this program. So we're in the middle of a very extensive policy development process with a large number of different stakeholders and working groups. And to give you an idea of what this process currently looks like, we have this slightly messy but instructive diagram where the development process is multifaceted, with on one a technical advisory group who we're collaborating with the consultant Synapse on working on, as well a residents advisory group where we're working with One Square World and alternatives for the community and environment on, as well as on top of that with multiple meetings of engaging the wider community public, as well as specific stakeholders such as yourself. We're also going to be convening, as mentioned before, several sector-specific focus groups, which will allow us to dive deeper into some of the questions that we'll be raising today and elsewhere. In terms of the technical advisory group, we have contains over 50 representatives of the building sector in Boston, specifically architects, engineers, facility managers, energy modelers, and other experts on building sciences. The TAG's role in the process is that they have begun by taking the existing BERDO data, assessing the data we've collected from those existing buildings so far, determining our potential performance standard targets, analyzing the potential multiple pathways for decarbonizations, the actual energy conservation measures and strategies that need to be pursued, and then looking at the potential average cost of those retrofit packages. The goal here is to help craft a performance standard that is feasible with current technologies for Boston's existing buildings and is not cost prohibitive. So we're right in the middle of the cost impact analysis portion of this, the TAG process. And this gives you an idea of the timeline that over the last few months and years that we've been pursuing. Right now in August, as you can see, we're convening and having these informational webinars to help raise awareness for the work that we've been working on, as well as and recruit for these sector-specific working groups. In addition, the technical advisory group meetings will be continuing over the coming months. So taking a look at the BERDO data that the TAG and Synapse has helped analyze so far. So this is from all the data that was submitted annually through BERDO, specifically for the calendar year 2018 data. Here on the left side, you can see the size of the different sectors reporting for BERDO just in terms of square footage. On the right, you see the impact in annual emissions from each sector. You can see in the large impact of hospitals and labs and the relatively lower emissions intensity of multifamily housing, which which makes sense given the known energy intensities of those different sectors. This is another way of showing the same data in the prior graphs. What you're seeing here is that each sliver or bar vertical represents one building. Its height is the greenhouse gas emissions per square foot, or emissions intensity, while its width is its total size in square footage. So each sliver area represents its overall emissions. The point in the color coding is separated out by individual sectors. The point here is to give you a good idea of the overall distribution of emissions across the Berto buildings. You can also see a very clear pattern where in each of the major building typologies, we see a few buildings with a very high emissions intensity, followed by a large group of buildings in the middle with similar intensities, and then a tail of lower emitting, high performing Berto buildings at the end. This kind of gives us a clue on some ways in which we might want to approach a emissions performance standard. So some of the big lessons from this analysis so far is we learned that that multifamily commercial spaces by far dominate the overall square footage of Berto, while labs, restaurants, and hospitals are by far the most carbon intensive. Those four sectors, represent the majority of Berto emissions. It says all these sectors have similar distributions with some high emitters and various long tails. So taking this baseline into account, these are some of the considerations that this policy development process has been discussing and which we'll be looking at for the remaining time. We know that each building has unique characteristics that have to be taken into account while we're all setting these standards, and we want to be designing flexibility into this policy from the ground up. Here are some of the examples of the areas where we are considering how to best provide flexibility while ensuring that we achieve our goals. Do we set specific emissions targets by threshold or focus on individual building self-improvement? Or do we allow both? How do we address different ownership structures? Can portfolios of buildings comply or must they stay individual? And how do we make sure that there are a variety of pathways and strategies available for buildings to choose how to meet any performance targets that this process comes to? So we want to introduce each of these topics and how they can impact the performance standard. The technical analysis consultants develop a set of initial scenario options for how the performance standard emissions targets could be set over time. So the first scenario is this idea of buildings are grouped by their property type, the sector, multifamily, hospitals, laboratories, and different targets are set for each of those groups over time. In any given period, buildings above a certain threshold need to act to reduce the emissions so that they can get below that threshold in time. And then those specific goals, those specific carbon thresholds would lower every X number of years, say every 5 years, we're going to say for this particular example. Thresholds set, and these thresholds are meant to put buildings on a pathway towards the 2050 carbon emissions goals. So at a very high level, this graph shows what that scenario one could look like. Fair amount. We'll drill down a little bit more on this, but the thing to gather from this is that that each of those colored bands you see, the red, the yellow, green, blue, across different sectors, those are what we're talking about when we're saying specific thresholds. So those are proposed, everything, this says draft, nothing's finalized here. But these are theoretic proposed thresholds for 2025, 2030, 2035, and so forth. To zoom in a little bit more on just office buildings so it's a little bit clearer, the idea here is that the highest emitter buildings, so those are on the left-hand side, will need to take action first, while lower emitting buildings, more in the middle and fall along the lines, have a little bit more time to think through strategies and ways in which they can go about complying. This was helped to create a longer planning horizon for buildings over time. It should also be noted that the cleaning of the grid is estimated to have beneficial impacts on building and performance over time. So to a certain extent, that would assist many buildings. And what you see here is like on one hand, 49 or so buildings will have to meet that first compliance period, but the buildings down the chart have a little bit more time. So that's one scenario. Another scenario is that buildings are on what we would call a self-improvement pathway. This is actually very similar to what we currently have under BERDO now with the energy action assessment requirement, where one compliance path is buildings have to reduce their energy consumption 50% or more over 5 years. Part of the idea here would be that baseline year set for all buildings, and the buildings targets set against this individual baseline for themselves. And so every building has to reduce emissions by X amount every X number of years. So again, 15% over 5 years or something to that effect. And this is the effect that you would see in scenario 1 across all the BERDO buildings. Just to, once again, to dive in a little bit deeper, what this means in practice is that every single building is trying to meet different, these 15% reduction goals every 5 years. So red 2025, yellow 2030, and so forth. And they're all comparing against themselves, but there's no, and everyone's kind of moving up in this way simultaneously. And then lastly, there's the scenario 3, which we say like each building chooses whether or not they want to be going towards a preset emissions target, or do we set or compare amongst them, do a self-improvement pathway. The idea here would be to create a little bit more flexibility. So the result of that, it creates a bit more complicated picture. But in practice, what we expect to see, and this is not, we're making assumptions here on how we imagine different buildings will react given choices between these two options. But in practice, what we expect to see is that buildings who are higher emitters will aim to do self-improvement pathways as it provides a better, more gradual compliance pathway, while middle and lower emitters will choose the targets. And many buildings will once again not act within those have to act within those first compliance cycles, but would have to do so in later cycles. So another question is to consider is portfolios. To what extent will buildings that are part of larger ownership structures be able to comply? Many of you have multiple buildings, dozens in some cases, that would be covered by the standard. Should each of these buildings comply individually, or do we allow for cases where buildings are included and blended with the larger portfolio? In theory, this could create flexibility to invest in one building, say one where you have a renovation plan, and apply savings from that building to others in your portfolio. That might help better mesh with your capital improvement cycles over the future. But then the question becomes, what happens when a building like that changes ownership and management? How do we ensure there's a continuity of data and responsibility from one ownership to the next? In terms of, so I think slightly out of order. Another question has been on, to what extent do we want to change the number of buildings covered by this requirement? Right now, about about a third of citywide somewhere between half and a third of citywide square feet is covered by the BERDO Ordinance. To what extent and that's with the current threshold of 35,000 square feet and higher. To what extent do we wish to lower that that threshold over time. This is an area where we're exploring of what would be the carbon impact for including, say, 20,000 square feet and higher buildings going forward. You know, in terms of emissions factors, this is a question that has been previously explored in the technical advisory group, and they've looked at this question quite a bit. Right now, as many of you know, you report through the Energy Star Portfolio Manager platform that has specific emissions factors assigned for things such as steam, district energy cogen, and especially the electrical grid that might not make sense for the Boston situation. They are created by the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level. So there's a interest in potentially looking at deriving specific emissions factors for these for this standard. And so far, the technical advisor group's preliminary recommendations has been to look at the rely on the ISO New England grid emissions factors with the mapped on proposed improvement plan that's been set out by the Massachusetts Clean Energy Standard moving forward, as well as looking at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities when it comes to our district energy facilities in terms of finding emissions emission systems for those. And this would kind of give you, and then there's the additional question of the current, how do we adapt to maybe more rapid cleaning of the grid compared to the existing Massachusetts strategy. Then there's a big question around renewable energy on-site, off-site, and offsets. There's a number of big questions in this area that the technical advisor group has been wrestling with. We know that we want to allow for things such as renewable energy credits and off-site renewable energy, but the question is how? How do we take into account off-site renewable emissions? Do we weight off-site renewable emissions differently than things such as on-site? And is the location of the off-site renewable generation important? And how do we take into account things, things such as RECs and power purchasing agreements in the current Massachusetts climate? And then lastly, how do we take into account additionality and to what extent? For the question of offsets, and this is all preliminary. We're not sure, whether or not we do go with offsets is to be determined. But if we were to do so, there comes, what are some of the considerations we can incorporate into any sort of offset compliance pathway? From the Carbon Free Boston report, there are a number of critical features that argue that should be included along that offsets should be permanent, that they should be additional, verifiable, enforceable, and real. And the question then comes, how do you calculate that? How do you keep track of that? So far, the technical advisor groups have said that we should definitely keep an eye towards flexibility for renewable energy purchase while trying to ensure additionality. Some of the considerations that have been recommended have included the zero code architecture from Architecture 2030, some of the Boston University selection criteria, as well as developing other sorts of custom weighting factors. But all these things are still in consideration. So that is the bulk of the, that's the overview of this work so far. But before I open up to a question, I do want to emphasize that this is just one of what's to be many opportunities for you to provide your ideas and feedback. We have another presentation that's going to be identical to this next on Thursday, but we also want to be encouraging folks to participate in potentially some of the focus groups that we might want to have. The call today is again about information sharing on the city's part. We are trying to organize these sector and topic specific focus groups in the upcoming weeks and months, and we encourage you to follow this link, and I'll try and post that into the chat soon. but please fill out the form when you have a chance. And thank you. So I wanted to first check to see if there's any, I don't see anything immediate in terms of the chat at the moment for questions, but wanted to open up more for what are your thoughts from all that? Folks want to comment or raise their hand? I think I do have a comment. Was he? So I have a comment from the Code Green Solutions. What is the overall timeline to decide on a path and roll it out? So is this a question more about the development of the policy or the or say the compliance path? I'll just answer both. Right now we have a little bit early in the slides, there is a goal of trying to develop this over the remainder of the year with ideally some form of final or draft policy by the end of the year. Obviously, COVID has created interesting new challenges, but that is the idea, and we do expect a ongoing and iterative process in this development moving forward. And there's not yet so that's one question. Any other thoughts? Let's go back to the slide with the focus group link. Well, there's no questions. We could end it there and give everyone more time for the lunch. Oh, we got another one. Can you go over the different scenarios a bit more? The difference between implementation. So at a high level, the difference, the 1, 2, and 3 are, one would be that the city, in collaboration with the technical advisor group and all these, establishes specific emissions thresholds for each sector and based off of the data that we have from Berto, based off of our analysis on what are the technical achievabilities of different emissions reduction scenarios and the cost thereof. And in that scenario, in 2025, 2030, 2035, you have these different these different emissions targets that a building is required to meet, and they can meet that threshold by different means, whether it's on-site energy efficiency measures, potentially, I think as we discussed, off-site renewable energy purchasing, and so forth. But the idea would be those emissions targets get more stringent over time, as you see in this way. The second scenario would be that each building is allowed to reduce their, the self-improvement trajectory. You start at X point and you are required to reduce your emissions by, again, any combination of on-site, off-site efficiency and renewable energy work. But you're required to reduce it by X percentage, again, say 15% every certain number of years. And then the third scenario is that there's flexibility and more flexibility where a building owner can choose what pathway makes the most sense for them. Is it to meet a specific, meet a specific emissions target? Is it to, do the self-improvement pathway or otherwise? Okay, we're getting a few more questions. So Bill has asked, how do we know where our buildings stand compared to each other? So that information comes from the Berto analysis. So this is all, yes. So this is all from the Berto reporting that we've been receiving over the last number of years. Specifically, we've been utilizing 2018 as our main data source. And this is a comparison based off of the majority, the major use category for each of these sectors and comparing them within those individual sectors. Can you talk about compliance? I'm curious about follow through and enforcement of this ordinance. How is it working now with getting property owners to comply? Are your properties complying? So in terms of present compliance, again, this present compliance season is not over yet, but our current compliance rate stands at about 80%. We're hopefully moving that as measured by gross square footage, is a little bit lower by individual properties. But by and large, we've gotten significant amount of compliance with the annual reporting up until now. But there is a question of how and to what extent we wish to both expand enforcement when it comes to non-compliance under the current Berto program, as well as for this potential update as well. So that is something under consideration of enforcement to ensure compliance as a priority. In terms of, but that's sort of the last resort measure. In terms, we do want to be encouraging folks to both comply to the existing requirements as is, as well as this potential new policy. And so programmatic assistance would be a big priority for the rollout and implementation of whatever the final form of this looks like. So Jonathan asked, will the emissions be measured by total GHG or emissions intensity in portfolio manager? To be determined. The thought is that emissions intensity will be how we set the target, while that allows us to more easily set targets across different sectors. We're not comparing the Prudential Center to a small, a 4-story office building. They don't have the exact, the way to compare those is to set emissions target based off of intensity, but that the total greenhouse gas emissions will be what you're trying to reduce. And so, you can do the math on that, but if a larger building is still, how do I say that? That you're lowering your overall emissions, and that will allow you to meet those particular emissions intensities. As it regards to portfolio manager, we'll likely may still use portfolio manager. We might not, but the idea will be that I think as mentioned before, that we'll be utilizing our own emissions intensity coefficients for electricity and other things. So we won't be necessarily using portfolio manager's way of calculating emissions intensity. We might be incorporating our own in some form. Ruben has asked, have there been any discussions about what kind of penalties may be imposed on those buildings not meeting the requirements? Again, we haven't had a direct, not yet. That this is an area where there's still discussion on what exactly would that look like. We do think that there needs to be some form of enforcement, but what that looks like and how deep does that go is still an open discussion. So that will likely be coming up in future parts of this process. Other thoughts? How about tax breaks for those who comply? That has not been part of the discussion as of yet. We do want to be thinking about ways in which um, the city is doing all that it can to assist those buildings working to meet these requirements. That might not necessarily be through the form of tax breaks, but um, that the programmatic um, assistance is a big part of piece of this, of how the city is helping. Will you be sitting around these slides? I think that yes. I think we, as mentioned before, we are recording this, at least in terms of the presentation piece. So I don't think there'll be an issue in sending around slides to Berto covered buildings to help keep you all informed on this. Do you plan, from Erica, do you plan to change how you calculate emissions from multiple use buildings? That is a discussion that the TAG is looking at very closely. Multi-use is a complicated area, but we definitely see the need for flexibility in that space, and there might be some form of weighted average or blending depending on the square footage and size of the different usages within the building. But yes, it is a topic area that we're looking at very closely. From Andy, do you participate with the portfolio? If you participate with the portfolio option, create a new market in zero or E plus buildings. The way car makers include less profitable. Do you anticipate that the portfolio option? Potentially. If I'm understanding your question correctly, is that would the portfolio option create more markets for net zero E plus buildings that the way car makers include less profitable cars to meet fleet efficiency standards? The idea here is to ensure that where there's actions being taken, as well as ensuring flexibility around existing capital improvement cycles. And while there might be a problem of a free rider approach in the short term for some portfolios, I will point out that the goal is still carbon neutrality. And these requirements are aimed to ratchet down or at least the idea is to ratchet them down significantly over the next 30 years. So, short-term flexibility, but long-term focus on the main goal. Andrew asks, do you have a opinion on adequacy of the proposed upgrade version of the Massachusetts stretch code now being considered by the BBRS? Slightly outside of the topic area for today, but that is something that the city is engaged in at the moment, and it is the city's position that we do want some version of a zero net carbon code, though we're still weighing the different proposals before us. So we do absolutely want the BBRS to put forward some options for municipalities for us to adopt. Does anyone care to express a view on the stretch code revision? So again, slightly out of topic. I think if other folks can talk on that, but that is one of the the city and the mayor has been clear that we want a net zero code in some form. Any other questions on the performance standard work? Jonathan asked, you mentioned change in ownership earlier. Is there a mechanism being considered to encourage sharing of data from one owner to the next? Perhaps mandatory sharing of data, or maybe it's report to Boston. Yeah, so that is something that that is a problem that we already are aware of in the existing Berto requirement, and sometimes new owners or new managers don't have access to past data, and it's a fair amount, and not always that information is being shared properly. So that is something under our consideration of ways in which the city can help to provide that sort of legal framework to ensure that information is being shared and transmitted from one owner or one manager to the next. We definitely think that the old is on the old owner to make sure that that information is being shared to whoever is who's newly responsible for that building. But that, yes, that is part of our considerations right now. Other thoughts? Again, I'm going to go over to, so definitely encourage folks to sign up for the focus group work that we are going to be engaged in. This will be a great opportunity for folks to be providing far more detailed thoughts on some of the stuff that I know that we've only been able to give a very sort of high initial level to. Just follow the bit.ly Boston Focus G, very straightforward. But if there's not, I'll give folks another chance, but if there's not any other big questions around the performance standard or right now, again, I want to thank you all for your time today. I know this is the first of many opportunities to provide feedback and to learn about what this standard will be looking like. As I think I've indicated, much of this work is still in progress. There's many moving parts, and we very much look forward to all of your input and engagement on what some of the final features might eventually look like. And again, I encourage anyone, if you don't already have my email address, please shoot me a line with anything you wish to contribute, any ideas, resources. One of the big things that we're looking for right now are case studies and any sort of examples on deep retrofits for existing buildings. That's those in terms of ground truthing, some of the analysis that we've done on costs and energy savings so far. So if you have anything like that, or know anyone who's done some good work in that area, that's definitely something we are looking for at the moment. And if there's nothing else, we can end it here, and you can enjoy the rest of your lunch. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everyone. And have a nice day. And again, we're going to be doing the same presentation more or less on Thursday. If you had any sort of lingering thoughts you wanted to join in on, please do there. But otherwise, have a lovely day.